Hey guys, welcome back. TJ here with DeadHistory, and welcome back to part 2 of our Declaration of Independence signer series, taking a look at John Hancock. That's right, today is part 2, the conclusion of John Hancock. Of course, today we're going to take a look at his life from about 1775 on. So basically, right before the Declaration of Independence, we're going to kind of kick it off with the Second Continental Congress and such. But, make sure you give us a like, thumbs up, hit subscribe, tell people about our channel. We would love that. I hope everybody did enjoy yesterday's part 1, taking a look at the early life of John Hancock. And the way I'm going to start off this part 2 is I'm actually going to kind of just go over a few fun facts and points that we really learned about in part 1. So almost like a refresher to kind of remind us of what we learned about and then move on to the new information here in part 2. So, again, flying solo for the audio. Henry may make an appearance. We shall see. But let's, without any further ado, let's get right to it. Part 2, John Hancock. So as we know from yesterday's part 1, John Hancock was a wealthy guy. He was from Massachusetts. His family had money. He inherited his uncle's fortune and estate when his uncle died, his Uncle Thomas. And John Hancock may have been the richest man in New England when he inherited the shipping fortune. We know he was a bright student. He graduated from Harvard at the age of 17. He probably should have been a loyalist, but he was not. His wealth and his social standing, he kind of, would be one of the people that would be more a loyalist, but he was not. Definitely smart, as we said. Friends in high places. One of his childhood friends was John Adams, who became second president of the United States. We know he witnessed history. He witnessed the coronation of King George III. He was very, very generous. Although he was rich and powerful, he was very concerned about the impoverished and, the community. He donated to churches, schools, organizations to basically help the less fortunate. He was very popular and he was highly regarded for his generosity. And although his background should have made him a loyalist, like I said, his friends, John Adams, Sam Adams, they were patriots, and he risked it all basically to go with them. So he was kind of a rabble-rouser. He did not like the threat the British had, on the colonies. He protested the Stamp Act, the Sugar Act. He was a part of the Sons of Liberty. Boston Tea Party, his famous phrase was, "Let every man do what is right in his own eyes." We know that. What else here? Smuggling. He was accused of smuggling. His ships, Lydia and the Liberty. We know about those incidents. Some really cool, just fun kind of things here with him. He had a role. Now listen, again, yesterday I said there was one source that said he was actually on the ships throwing tea overboard during the Boston Tea Party. And then another source said he wasn't. He was just kind of a rebel-rouser. And that's also what this source that I'm reading says, that he wasn't on a ship tossing tea overboard. He was at meetings when outrage was vented at the British, and he riled up the crowd with that famous statement, "Let every man do what is right in his own eyes." So, I don't know. I don't think he probably was on the ships, but there's conflicting reports, so to speak. What else is some fun things about him? He was adopted by his uncle. Technically, he was actually adopted when he was 7 years old. So, pretty interesting stuff. When his father, Reverend Hancock, died, his family was actually homeless. Their house was promised to his replacement, and basically John ended up in the care of Thomas Hancock, and he did adopt him. So that is pretty interesting. Let me see what else here. Just kind of looking over some things. Make sure I'm not missing anything from yesterday. I think that's pretty much it. I think for the most part, that's the early stuff that we learned about. So there's a lot of other things we're going to learn about, but that's going to be here in part 2. So here we go. Let's start to learn some new things and pick up where we left off, which was in the spring of 1775. That is where we left off yesterday, basically as John Hancock and Sam Adams were headed to Philadelphia to be a part of the Second Continental Congress. So let's pick it up there. So as we learned yesterday toward the end, it was either in late November or early December of 1774, the Provincial Congress elected John Hancock as a delegate to the Second Continental Congress to replace James Bowdoin, who had been unable to attend the First Congress because of illness. Before John Hancock reported to the Continental Congress in Philadelphia, the Provincial Congress unanimously re-elected him as their president in February of 1775. Hancock's multiple roles gave him enormous influence in Massachusetts, and, we kind of learned that yesterday. Now, after attending the Provincial Congress in Concord in April of 1775, John Hancock and Sam Adams decided that it was not safe to return to Boston before leaving for Philadelphia, so they went and stayed instead at Hancock's childhood home in Lexington. We learned that yesterday. Now, there's an interesting little story about Lexington, so here we go. So, of course, Thomas Gage, the general, the governor at the time now, he received a letter from Lord Dartmouth on April 14th of 1775 advising him to arrest the principal actors and abettors in the Provincial Congress whose proceedings appear in every light to be acts of treason and rebellion. On the night of April 18th, Gage sent out a detachment of soldiers on the fateful mission that sparked the American Revolutionary War. The purpose of the British expedition was to seize and destroy military supplies that the colonists had stored in Concord. According to many historical accounts, Gage also instructed his men to arrest Hancock and Adams. If so, the written orders issued by Gage made no mention of arresting the Patriot leaders. Gage apparently decided that he had nothing to gain by arresting Hancock and Adams, since other leaders would simply take their place and the British would be portrayed as the aggressors. So pretty interesting stuff there. Now, the really interesting thing is, so just to kind of get into it, I'm looking here, where is the one thing that I did want to read to you guys that was pretty interesting. Here we go. By spring of 1775, the British took a more adamant position towards suppressing the rebels and seizing their leaders. On April 17th, 1775, Paul Revere communicated with Dr. Jeremy Belknap, giving him the signal once British movement was identified. He stated, "If the British went out by water, we would show 2 lanterns in the North Church steeple, and if by land, 1 as a signal." On the following night, Paul Revere, William Dawes, and Dr. Samuel Prescott, after getting word that the British were crossing the Charles River in boats en route to Concord, set out to warn the Patriots. Revere was able to warn Samuel Adams and John Hancock. However, afterward, he was halted by the British and detained. While the British moved to the Black Horse Tavern, where they had been told they would find Hancock, he was on his way to Lexington. But several other Patriots from the Committee of Safety had spent the night at the tavern and just barely escaped capture by hiding in a cornfield in back of the inn. Meanwhile, John Hancock had some enjoyable diversion from the sound of the guns and the danger he faced if the British caught him. He had earlier evaded capture several times. The first attempt occurred at Salem when the British rode to the church expecting to nab their prey. However, the column was spotted and the congregation was told to leave. A contingent under Colonel Timothy Pickering sped to the bridge, but the British chose to retire rather than engage the troops. John Hancock and Sam Adams had been hiding at various places ever since the arrival of General Gage, but he had also met a young woman, Dorothy Quincy, the daughter of Judge Edmund and Elizabeth Wendell Quincy. Hancock had been at the Clark's house when he was warned by Paul Revere. During that time, Dorothy was a guest at the home of Reverend James Clark, a relative of John Hancock. Dorothy's father had been out of town, and the invitation to stay with the Clark family came from Lydia Hancock, an aunt of John's who lived in the same house as the Reverend Clark. Hancock was warned to remain in Lexington until British intent was discovered. And when he was told that Dorothy was a guest at the Clarks, he was easily convinced to stay. Samuel Adams also stayed there. The two sides clashed at Lexington and Concord on April 19th, ending all paths to reconciliation. The British were met by the Minutemen, and the Redcoats were forced to retire to Boston. But for the entire line of retreat, they were hit by fire from Minutemen scattered about the entire route. Afterward, the British were corralled within the city limits, while the Patriots awaited reinforcements. So that's one account of the goings-on, so to speak. Now, another account that I want to read to you guys is right here. Although Gage had evidently decided against seizing Hancock and Adams, Patriots initially believed otherwise. From Boston, Joseph Warren dispatched messenger Paul Revere to warn Hancock and Adams that British troops were on the move and might attempt to arrest them. Revere reached Lexington around midnight and gave the warning. Hancock, still considering himself a militia colonel, wanted to take the field with the Patriot militia at Lexington, but Adams and others convinced him to avoid battle, arguing that he was more valuable as a political leader than as a soldier. As Hancock and Adams made their escape, the first shots of the war were fired at Lexington and Concord. Soon after the battle, Gage issued a proclamation granting a general pardon to all who would lay down their arms and return to the duties of the peaceable subjects, with the exceptions of Hancock and Samuel Adams. Singling out Hancock and Adams in this manner only added to the renown among patriots. On April 18, 1775, Hancock and fellow revolutionary Samuel Adams were lodging in Lexington, Massachusetts at the former home of Hancock's grandfather. Little did they know that the shot heard round the world would go off in just a few short hours. And no, I do not mean this shot heard round the world. No, not that one. The Giants were not winning the pennant in 1775. However, on the orders of the British government, General Thomas Gage led 700 Redcoat troops. They were trying to obviously sees militias, and they were trying to find Hancock. Paul Revere warned them. But to Revere's surprise, this is another little anecdote, Hancock had not left. Instead, he loudly insisted on staying put and fighting alongside the militiamen. "If I had my musket," Hancock said, "I would never turn my back on these troops." Eventually, Revere and Adams convinced him to flee, arguing that the British would score a huge moral victory by jailing such an influential patriot. So, and this wasn't an easy sell, as eyewitness Dorothy Quincy, Hancock's fiancée, noted, "It was not until break of day that Mr. Hancock could be persuaded." So, pretty interesting little facts about the whole Lexington and Concord connection with John Hancock. I thought that was pretty cool. British troops, they were really hunting for him, as well as for military supplies that were stored for militia use. But Hancock had to be talked out of the battlefield. So it was pretty interesting stuff, pretty cool stuff. So I feel like this next section and information that I'm about to explain to everybody, I feel like I should have Bruce Springsteen's Streets of Philadelphia playing in the background. It's like, and now, meanwhile, on the streets of Philadelphia, so the climactic build-up here. In Philadelphia, Congress was taking action to resist the British, and on May 24th of 1775, John Hancock was elected president of the Second Continental Congress. Hancock succeeded Peyton Randolph. Randolph, like John Hancock and Sam Adams, was on the list of condemned rebels who were to be seized and hanged. An armed guard escorted Peyton Randolph back to Virginia. Shortly after Hancock assumed the presidency, General Thomas Gage expressed his thoughts on the election. On June 13th, Gage declared martial law and proclaimed that all who lay down their arms except Sam Adams and John Hancock shall receive a pardon. So another little interesting fact, as I said, Peyton Randolph, that is who John Hancock succeeded, of course, as president of the Second Continental Congress. But that was also after Henry Middleton declined the nomination. So that's kind of an interesting little fact and tidbit there. John Hancock was a good choice for president for several reasons. He was experienced, having often presided over legislative bodies and town meetings in Massachusetts. His wealth and social standing inspired the confidence of moderate delegates, while his association with Boston radicals made him acceptable to other radicals. His position was somewhat ambiguous because the role of the president was not fully defined, and it was not clear if Randolph had resigned or was on a leave of absence. So that's kind of an interesting fact there. They didn't even know if Randolph was coming back or what the deal was. Like other presidents of Congress, John Hancock's authority was mostly limited to that of a presiding officer. He also had to handle a great deal of official correspondence, and he found it necessary to hire clerks at his own expense to help with paperwork. In Congress, on June 15th of 1775, Massachusetts delegate John Adams nominated George Washington as commander-in-chief of the army, then gathered around Boston. Years later, Adams wrote that John Hancock had shown great disappointment at not getting the command for himself. This brief comment from 1801 is the only source for the oft-cited claim that John Hancock sought to become commander-in-chief. In the early 20th century, historian James Truslow Adams, wrote that the incident initiated a lifelong estrangement between John Hancock and George Washington. But some subsequent historians have expressed doubt that the incident or the estrangement ever occurred. According to historian Donald Proctor, there is no contemporary evidence that John Hancock harbored ambitions to be named commander-in-chief. Quite the contrary. John Hancock and George Washington maintained a good relationship after the alleged incident, and in 1778, John Hancock named his only son John George Washington Hancock. John Hancock admired and supported General Washington, even though Washington politely declined John Hancock's request for a military appointment. John Hancock traveled to Fairfield, Connecticut in August of 1775, and while there on the 23rd of August, he married Dorothy, his fiancée. Together, the couple had 2 children, a daughter who died while an infant and a son who died young. Dorothy was as bold and daring as her husband. She and John's Aunt Lydia watched the fighting at Lexington from the house. After the battle, Lydia told John that she was returning to her father's house in Boston, and John had forbid her to go due to the British occupation, saying, "No, madam, you shall not return as long as a British bayonet remains in Boston." Lydia was less than intimidated and retorted, "Recollect, Mr. Hancock, I am not under your authority yet. I shall go to my father's house." Nonetheless, Aunt Lydia afterward persuaded Dorothy of the great danger. Together, Lydia and Dorothy instead traveled to Fairfield and remained there at the residence of the Reverend Thaddeus Burr. When Dorothy Quincy finally got to return to Boston, she was Dorothy Hancock. So this was all during when the Second Continental Congress was actually in recess, when Hancock traveled to Fairfield, Connecticut. And there, he took that opportunity, like I just said, to wed his fiancée, Dorothy Dolly Quincy. They had 2 children. Neither of them did survive to adulthood. Their daughter, Lydia Henchman Hancock, was born in 1776 and died 10 months later. And their son, John, was born in 1778 and died in 1787 after suffering a head injury while ice skating. So, kind of an interesting thing there. Sad, but interesting. While he was president of Congress, John Hancock became involved in a long-running controversy with Harvard. As treasurer of the college since 1773, he had been entrusted with the school's financial records and about 15,000 pounds in cash and securities. In the rush of events at the onset of the Revolutionary War, Hancock had been unable to return the money and accounts to Harvard before leaving for Congress. In 1777, a Harvard committee headed by James Bowdoin, Hancock's chief political and social rival in Boston, sent a messenger to Philadelphia to retrieve the money and records. John Hancock was offended, but he turned over more than 16,000 pounds, though not all of the records, to the college. When Harvard replaced Hancock as treasurer, his ego was bruised, and for years, he declined to settle the account or pay the interest on the money he had held. Despite pressure put on him by Bowdoin and other political opponents, the issue dragged on until after Hancock's death, when his estate finally paid the college more than 1,000 pounds to resolve the matter. Pretty interesting. On September 26th of 1775, John Hancock wrote to George Washington to instruct him to select winter quarters for the army. Later that year, Washington wrote to John Hancock to inform him that it was impossible to enlist troops who would serve for the duration. On December 14th of 1775, John Hancock was appointed to the committee that was charged with fitting the armed ships. On January 1st of 1776, General Washington reorganized the Continental Army while Congress continued to devise methods of acquiring supplies and ammunition for the troops. Congress was aware of the great pressures upon it, and without much time for relaxation, the members remained in session at times, even on Sundays, to cope with the never-ending task of maintaining the government and the armed forces. In February of 1776, although John Hancock was weighed down with his responsibilities as president of the Congress, Massachusetts commissioned him as a major general of militia. Later that year, as the nation was moving toward declaring independence, John Hancock on June 4th, 1776, encouraged the colonies to make preparations to defend against the British and to encourage their citizens that you will be able to lead them to victory, to liberty, and to happiness. John Hancock served in Congress through some of the darkest days of the Revolutionary War. The British drove George Washington from New York and New Jersey in 1776, which prompted Congress to flee to Baltimore. John Hancock and Congress returned to Philadelphia in March of 1777, but were compelled to flee 6 months later when the British occupied Philadelphia. John Hancock wrote innumerable letters to colonial officials raising money, supplies, and troops for Washington's army. He chaired the Marine Committee and took pride in helping to create a small fleet of American frigates, including the USS Hancock, which was named in his honor. On July 4th of 1776, Congress adopted the Declaration of Independence, a document drafted by Thomas Jefferson stating that the 13 American colonies were free from British rule. The document also detailed the importance of individual rights and freedoms. As president of the Continental Congress, John Hancock is credited as the first signer of the Declaration of Independence. His prominent, stylish signature became famous. According to legend, Hancock boldly inscribed his name so the English king would not need glasses to read it. Today, the term John Hancock is synonymous with signature. And we're going to get into that whole little fun myth about the king and all that, because that's not exactly true. So we will get into that, though. Here's some more information about the signing. John Hancock was president of Congress when the Declaration of Independence was adopted and signed. He is primarily remembered by Americans for his large, flamboyant signature on the Declaration. Of course, John Hancock is synonymous with signature. According to legend, Hancock signed his name largely so that King George could read it without his spectacles. But the story is apocryphal and originated years later. So it's really not true at all. Contrary to popular mythology, there was no ceremonial signing of the Declaration on July 4th of 1776. After Congress approved the wording of the text on July 4th, the fair copy was sent to be printed. As president, John Hancock may have signed the document that was sent to the printer, John Dunlap. But this is uncertain because that document is lost, perhaps destroyed in the printing process. Dunlap produced the first published version of the Declaration, the widely distributed Dunlap broadside. Hancock, as president of Congress, was the only delegate whose name appeared on the broadside, although the name of Charles Thomson, secretary of the Continental Congress, but not a delegate, was also on it as attested by, implying that Hancock had signed for the fair copy. This meant that until a second broadside was issued 6 months later with all of the signers listed, John Hancock was the only delegate whose name was publicly attached to the treasonous document. John Hancock sent a copy of the Dunlap broadside to George Washington, instructing him to have it read to the troops in the way you shall think most proper. John Hancock's name was printed, not signed, on the Dunlap broadside. His iconic signature appears on a different document, a sheet of parchment that was carefully handwritten sometime after July 19th and signed on August 2nd by John Hancock and those delegates present. Known as the engrossed copy, this is the famous document that is on display at the National Archives in Washington, D.C. So when they all met up in August of 1776, during that ceremony in August of 1776, John Hancock stated to Benjamin Franklin, "We must all hang together." And Benjamin Franklin quipped, "We must all hang together, "Oh, most assuredly, we shall each hang separately." John Hancock's signature was quite large and recognizable. Legend has it, we know that about the whole signature with King George. Not true. So he signed the document. Now, what happens after that, right? We're already into August of 1776. Well, now we got to talk about 1777 and beyond. So let's take a look. So now we got to, like I said, take a look at 1777 and beyond. So obviously we just discussed the signing of the Declaration of Independence. And now, what went on after that, right? I mean, that's kind of what we have to figure out and learn about what happened. So just to read some excerpts from different sources. John Hancock remained president of Congress until November 1st of 1777, the month following the surrender of British General John Burgoyne at Saratoga. Poor health prompted Hancock to resign, but he remained in Congress into 1779. During 1778, John recuperated sufficiently that he was able to take command of the militia. He led the Massachusetts troops during the Rhode Island campaign, commanded by General John Sullivan, during the unsuccessful attempt to retake Newport from the British. A French fleet was to support the offensive, but it did not arrive. The Americans were compelled to retire to the mainland in late August. Another source here that I'm going to kind of read from. When he resigned... wait, nope, that's not what I'm looking for. I apologize. In October of 1777, after more than 2 years in Congress, Hancock requested a leave of absence. He asked George Washington to arrange a military escort for his return to Boston. Although Washington was short on manpower, he nevertheless sent 15 horsemen to accompany Hancock on his journey home. By this time, John Hancock had become estranged from Samuel Adams, who disapproved of what he viewed as Hancock's vanity and extravagance, which Adams believed were inappropriate in a Republican leader. When Congress voted to thank Hancock for his service, Adams and the other Massachusetts delegates voted against the resolution, as did a few delegates from other states. Back in Boston, John Hancock was reelected to the House of Representatives. As in previous years, his philanthropy made him popular. Although his finances had suffered greatly because of the war, he gave to the poor, helped support widows and orphans, and loaned money to friends. According to biographer William Fowler, John Hancock was a generous man, and the people loved him for it. He was their idol. In December of 1777, he was reelected as a delegate to the Continental Congress and as a moderator of the Boston town meeting. John Hancock rejoined the Continental Congress in Pennsylvania in June of 1778, but his brief time there was unhappy. In his absence, Congress had elected Henry Laurens as its new president, which was a disappointment to Hancock, who had hoped to reclaim his chair. John Hancock got along poorly with Samuel Adams and missed his wife and newborn son. And on July 9th of 1778, Hancock and the other Massachusetts delegates joined the representatives from 7 other states in signing the Articles of Confederation. The remaining states were not yet prepared to sign, and the Articles were not ratified until 1781. John Hancock returned to Boston in July of 1778, motivated by the opportunity to finally lead men in combat. Back in 1776, he had been appointed as the senior major general of the Massachusetts militia. Now that the French fleet had come to the aid of the Americans, General Washington instructed General John Sullivan to lead an attack on the British garrison in Newport, Rhode Island. In August of 1778, John Hancock nominally commanded 6,000 militiamen in the campaign, although he let the professional soldiers do the planning and issue the orders. It was a fiasco. French Admiral d'Estaing abandoned the operation, after which Hancock's militia mostly deserted Sullivan's Continentals. John Hancock suffered some criticism for the debacle, but he emerged from his brief military career with his popularity intact. After much delay, the Massachusetts Constitution finally went into effect in October of 1780. To no one's surprise, John Hancock was elected governor of Massachusetts in a landslide, garnering over 90% of the vote. In the absence of formal party politics, the contest was one of personality, popularity, and patriotism. John Hancock was immensely popular and unquestionably patriotic, given his personal sacrifices and his leadership of the Second Continental Congress. Bowdoin, his principal opponent, was cast by Hancock's supporters as unpatriotic, citing among other things his refusal, which was due to poor health, to serve in the First Continental Congress. Bowdoin's supporters, who were principally off commercial interests from Massachusetts' coastal communities, cast Hancock as a foppish demagogue who pandered to the populace. Interesting strong words there. And just to give you kind of a count, John Hancock received 11,000 votes out of 12,281 votes cast, for a total of 17 candidates. So, pretty interesting. He held the post of governor till 1785, when he declined to run for another term. He eventually was succeeded by James Bowdoin, who was elected by the legislature. John Hancock was also elected as a member of the Massachusetts Constitutional Convention. Meanwhile, John Hancock was returned to the Continental Congress and served in 1785 and 1786. He was also returned as governor during 1787 and remained in office for the rest of his life. Hancock governed Massachusetts through the end of the Revolutionary War and into an economically troubled post-war period, repeatedly winning re-election by wide margins. Hancock took a hands-off approach to governing, avoiding controversial issues as much as possible. According to William Fowler, Hancock never really led and never used his strength to deal with the critical issues confronting the Commonwealth. John Hancock governed until his surprise resignation on January 29th of 1785. Hancock cited his failing health as the reason, but he may have become aware of growing unrest in the countryside and wanted to get out of office before the trouble came. Hancock's critics sometimes believed that he used claims of illness to avoid difficult political situations. Historian James Truslow Adams writes that Hancock's two chief resources were his money and his gout. The first always used to gain popularity, and the second to prevent his losing it. The turmoil that Hancock avoided ultimately blossomed at Shays' Rebellion, which Hancock's successor Bowdoin had to deal with. After the uprising, John Hancock was re-elected in 1787, and he promptly pardoned all the rebels. The next year, a controversy arose when three free blacks were kidnapped from Boston and sent to work as slaves in the French colony of Martinique in the West Indies. Governor Hancock wrote to the governors of the islands on their behalf. As a result, the three men were released and returned to Massachusetts. John Hancock was re-elected to annual terms as governor for the remainder of his life. In 1787 also, the Constitutional Convention convened in Philadelphia. The U.S. Constitution was adopted on September 17, 1787, effective upon ratification by 9 states. Governor Hancock supported ratification and used all of his persuasive powers to bring it into fruition. However, during the state ratification convention, his gout caused problems that forced him to miss some sessions. Out of the 360 delegates, Hancock had been selected to preside over the convention. Nonetheless, he recovered and returned to Congress. Massachusetts ratified the Constitution on February 6th of 1788 to become the sixth state to enter the Union. When Hancock had resigned as governor in 1785, he was again elected as a delegate to Congress, known as the Confederation Congress, after the ratification of the Articles of Confederation in 1781. Congress had declined in importance after the Revolutionary War and was frequently ignored by the states. John Hancock was elected to serve as its president on November 23rd of 1785, but he never attended because of his poor health and because he was disinterested. He sent Congress a letter of resignation in June of 1786. In an effort to remedy the perceived defects of the Articles of Confederation, delegates were first sent to the Annapolis Convention in 1786 and then to the Philadelphia Convention in 1787, where they drafted the United States Constitution, which was then sent to the states for ratification or rejection. John Hancock, who was not present at the Philadelphia Convention, had misgivings about the Constitution's lack of a Bill of Rights and its shift of power to a central government. In January of 1788, John Hancock was elected president of the Massachusetts Ratifying Convention, although he was ill and not present when the convention began. Hancock mostly remained silent during the contentious debates, but as the convention was drawing to a close, he gave a speech in favor of ratification. For the first time in years, Samuel Adams supported Hancock's position. Even with the support of Hancock and Adams, the Massachusetts Convention narrowly ratified the Constitution by a vote of 187 to 168. John Hancock's support was probably a deciding factor in the ratification. John Hancock was put forth as a candidate, actually, in the 1789 U.S. presidential election, and as was the custom in an era where political ambition was viewed with suspicion, Hancock did not campaign or even publicly express interest in the office. He instead made his wishes known indirectly. Like everyone else, Hancock knew that Washington was going to be elected as the first president. But John Hancock may have been interested in being vice president despite his poor health. Hancock received only 4 electoral votes in the election, however, none of them from his home state at all. The Massachusetts electors all voted for John Adams, who received the second highest number of electoral votes and thus became vice president. Although Hancock was disappointed with his performance in the election, he continued to be popular in the state of Massachusetts. And guess what? I found a special guest. Hi, Mr. Henry.
Hello.
How you doing?
I'm good.
Yeah?
Yep.
Thanks for popping in on the audio here.
You're welcome.
Yeah, it's John Hancock.
Yep.
Our first Declaration of Independence signer series, right?
Yeah.
Very good. And I see you, it's your birthday weekend here, and we just had cupcakes, and you have chocolate all over your cheek, I just noticed. It looks like you enjoyed that cupcake a little bit, no?
Yeah.
A little bit? So, what else is going on? How's school? Good?
Yes.
All right. So this is going to be pretty cool, right? Do you know what state? I actually just said it, that John Hancock was from?
Massachusetts.
Massachusetts, that's right. Very good. Very good. You know, you should know that anyway, because we were right there in his hometown not too long ago.
A month ago.
No, it was about 2 months ago now. Yeah, it was in August. Yep. So, good stuff though, right?
Mm-hmm.
All right. Well, thanks for popping in and saying hi to everybody.
You're welcome.
And we'll see you for our next signer, or maybe the one after that, right?
Yes.
All right. Bye-bye, Henry.
Bye.
With his health failing, John Hancock spent his final years as essentially a figurehead governor. With his wife at his side, he died in bed on October 8th of 1793 at the age of 56. By order of acting Governor Samuel Adams, the day of Hancock's burial was a state holiday. The lavish funeral was perhaps the grandest given to an American up to that time. It was very unexpectedly that he died on October 8th of 1793, and his wife, Dorothy Quincy Hancock, remarried several years after the death of John. She married Captain James Scott, who had been a friend of Governor Hancock. And Dorothy Hancock Scott herself died on February 3rd of 1830. It is not less honorable to the character of John Hancock that while wealth and independence powerfully tempted him to a life of indolence, he devoted himself for many years, almost without intermission, to the most laborious service of his country. Malevolence, during some periods of his public life, aspersed his character and imputed to him motives of conduct to which he was a stranger. Full justice was done to his memory at his death, in the expressions of grief and affection which were offered over his remains by the multitudes who thronged his house while his body lay in state, and who followed his remains to the grave. Despite his grand funeral, John Hancock faded from popular memory after his death. According to historian Alfred F. Young, Boston celebrated only one hero in the half-century after the Revolution, George Washington. As early as 1809, John Adams lamented that Hancock and Samuel Adams were almost buried in oblivion. In Boston, little effort was made to preserve Hancock's historical legacy. His house on Beacon Hill was torn down in 1863 after both the city of Boston and the Massachusetts legislature decided against maintaining it. According to historian Young, the conservative new elite of Massachusetts was not comfortable with a rich man who pledged his fortune to the cause of revolution. In 1876, with the centennial of American independence renewing popular interest in the Revolution, plaques honoring Hancock were put up in Boston. In 1896, a memorial column was erected over Hancock's essentially unmarked grave in the Granary Burying Ground. No full-length biography of Hancock appeared until the 20th century. A challenge facing Hancock biographers is that, compared to prominent founding fathers like Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, John Hancock left relatively few personal writings for historians to use in interpreting his life. As a result, most depictions of John Hancock have relied on the voluminous writings of his political opponents, who were often scathingly critical of him. According to historian Charles Akers, the chief victim of Massachusetts historiography has been John Hancock, the most gifted and popular politician in the Bay State's long history. He suffered the misfortune of being known to later generations almost entirely through the judgments of his detractors, Tory and Whig. John Hancock's most influential 20th century detractor was historian James Truslow Adams, who wrote negative portraits of Hancock in Harper's Magazine and the Dictionary of American Biography in the 1930s. Adams argued that Hancock was a fair presiding officer but had no great ability and was prominent only because of his inherited wealth. Decades later, historian Donald Proctor argued that Adams had uncritically repeated the negative views of Hancock's political opponents without doing any serious research. Adams presented a series of disparaging incidents and anecdotes, sometimes partially documented, sometimes not documented at all, which in some leave one with a distinctly unfavorable impression of Hancock. According to Proctor, Adams evidently projected his own disapproval of 1920s businessmen onto Hancock and ended up misrepresenting several key events in Hancock's career. Writing in the 1970s, Proctor and Akers called for scholars to evaluate Hancock based on his merits rather than on the views of his critics. Since that time, historians have usually presented a more favorable portrait of John Hancock while acknowledging that he was not an important writer, political theorist, or military leader. Many places and things in the United States have been named in honor of John Hancock. The U.S. Navy has named vessels USS Hancock and USS John Hancock. A World War II Liberty ship was also named in his honor. 10 states have a Hancock County named for him. Other places named after him include Hancock, Massachusetts, Hancock, New York, and Mount Hancock in New Hampshire, among others. The defunct John Hancock University was named for him, as was the John Hancock Financial Company, founded in Boston in 1862. It had no connection to Hancock's own business ventures. The financial company passed on the name to the John Hancock Tower in Boston, the John Hancock Center in Chicago, as well as the John Hancock Student Village at Boston University. Hancock was a charter member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences in 1780. So, in wrapping up things here, guys, just want to touch on a couple other things that I found kind of interesting. John Hancock made his last public appearance on September 18th of 1793 when he appeared before the Massachusetts legislature. He told the legislators that he was so ill that they would not be able to hear him if he spoke, so he sat by as the Secretary of State read his address. At the end of the address, Hancock made the following remarks: "I rely upon your candor to pardon this mode of addressing you. I feel the seeds of mortality growing fast within me, but I think I have, in this case, done no more than my duty as a servant of the people. I never did, and I never will deceive them while I have life and strength to act in their service." John Hancock died 3 weeks later on October 3rd of 1793. Some other facts about Hancock we already kind of went over. By far and away, the largest signature, of course, on the Declaration. It dwarfs the competition. The vast majority of the signatures take up somewhere between 1 and 2.5 square inches. Hancock's takes up a whopping 6.1 square inches. It's the biggest by far. Historians really aren't sure why he signed it so big. I really think that the reason primarily pretty much was because he was the only signature on the original document. So I feel like maybe he thought everyone was going to sign it that large. You know what I mean? Maybe he thought everyone was going to sign it very big and bold, and there was going to be enough room for all the delegates to sign that large. Maybe that's why. I'm not exactly sure, and historians are really not sure. So, he was the first elected governor of Massachusetts, we said. He was a presidential also ran in 1789. Of course, him and Sam Adams had that huge falling out. They, were not friends for quite a long time. He had gout for many, 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 many years. He developed the illness of gout when he was like 36. And these years went by, his limbs were severely handicapped by the condition. So when George Washington was president, he actually visited Massachusetts in 1789. And at that time, John Hancock was 53 years old and the governor of Massachusetts. He actually had to be carried out in order to greet Washington. So, pretty crazy stuff. Boston's tallest tower was named in his honor. The 60-story glass-sided structure also appears to be the tallest building in all of New England. The establishment was created by John Hancock Financial Services, a company named after the legendary Patriot. It's basically known as the John Hancock Tower. So, pretty interesting there in Boston, tallest tower. Never said the whole thing about King George. We'll be able to read that. Not true, of course, as we said. Yeah, I mean, that's pretty much it, guys. That's kind of really the best overview. I did also touch, of course, upon his children. They had 2 children, him and his wife, Dorothy. Their daughter was named Lydia Henchman Hancock. She was born in 1776, but she died only 2 months later. And, of course, their second child, born in 1787, John George Washington Hancock, he was only 8 when he drowned in an ice skating accident, actually in Milton, Massachusetts. They had no other children, of course. Yeah, I mean, that's, like I said, that really is kind of the life legacy and interesting facts about the very first signer of the Declaration of Independence, John Hancock. I hope you guys enjoyed this debut video here for our Declaration of Independence signer series, taking a look at John Hancock. Next week, stay tuned. We will indeed be taking a look. Like I said, we're going to go from left to right on the document. So next week, we will take a look at our next signer. So stay tuned for that. It's going to be a lot of fun. And also, stay tuned for some really great bonus footage. We have some great bonus footage to show you guys. So make sure you stay tuned for that. It's going to be a lot of fun. And hope you enjoy it. Hancock is buried, just so everyone is aware, and you will see this in the bonus footage. He is buried at the Granary Burying Ground right there in Boston, Massachusetts. There are a lot of famous people buried at the Granary Burying Ground. I mean, I'm talking John Hancock, Sam Adams, Paul Revere. I mean, there's a lot. So, there's a lot of them there. Enjoy it. You're going to see my photos from when I visited there. So enjoy it. Yeah, so plus, as well as in the bonus footage, you're going to see some of the like a statue of John Hancock in the Hancock-Adams Common area in Quincy, Massachusetts. You're also going to see a statue. It's a bust of John Hancock. Those are not my photos. Those are actually taken by Kurt Dion of kurtzhistoric.sites.com. You'll see on when those photos are on the screen. I'll put Kurt's website information up there on the screen so you can see that. You're going to see John Hancock's parents' gravesite and tomb right there in Quincy, Massachusetts. So you're going to see all of that in the bonus footage. So enjoy it. And yeah, that's pretty much it. I will definitely see you guys next week. Thank you for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed this look at John Hancock. And we will see you next week. Bye-bye, guys.